Deep in the frozen bitterroot wilderness, a faint, desperate cry shattered the stillness of the night. A mother bear named Mara was losing her battle to give birth, while Brutus, the mate who had never feared anything, ran in frantic circles, helpless to save her. Wolves were closing in, 1 minute late, and the storm would claim them all. But miles away, Ranger Lydia caught the bear's failing signal, and a race for life began. The storm had not fully arrived yet, but the Bitterroot Mountains already breathed frost into every hollow and drew a thin white veil across the pines. Inside a shallow rock den at the base of a granite outcrop, a black bear named Mara lay on her side, ribs fluttering under matted fur. Each contraction rose like a wave and broke without deliverance, leaving her trembling and spent. Her breath steamed and vanished. For hours, she had fought a fight that nature usually settled quickly. Tonight, nature stalled and watched. Brutus circled the mouth of the den, his massive shoulders rolling under a winter coat that caught stray flakes. He had fought many things: moose in lean springs, a rival boar last year, but he had no weapon for this. He nosed Mara's cheek, drawing a weak blink from her caramel eyes, then swung back to the doorway as if he could guard her from the thing she was battling inside. The wind slipped through the pines with a sound like distant surf. Brutus tasted the air and lifted his head, ears turning. Something else listened in the snow. Across the drainage, where the forest opened to a sheet of ice and meadow grass locked hard as iron, a gray shape paused. Then another. Wolves slid between trees like thinking shadows, their bodies quiet, their noses testing the current. The sound that carried to them was fragile. A muffled whimper, a low moan, a heavy animal failing at something essential. Hunger sharpened attention. They fanned out, small prints pocking the crust, and the cold air turned their breath to pale penance. Miles away, in a warm-lit equipment barn, Ranger Lydia Cooper stood alone at a workbench, logging collar pings from wintering bears into a spreadsheet she had customized too many times to admit. It was the kind of late mountain evening that felt more like morning in some other life. A thermos clicked. Coffee rolled bitter and comforting over her tongue. Her monitor blinked. The collar registered to F431 Mara, flashed yellow, then red. Heart rate erratic. Body temperature dropping in pulses. Lydia's own breath caught out of instinct. She tapped open the trend line and checked the last known location over a map speckled with blue creeks and old fire scars. The icon hovered near Sawtooth Ridge, on the cold side of a slope where the wind scraped hard. Birthing season had come early this year, or trouble had. She grabbed the trauma kit by muscle memory. Stethoscope, sterile blades, IV fluids, tranq darts balanced to the ounce for pregnancy, and thunked it into the ATV, cargo rack. Keys bit her palm. A sleeve of cloud dragged the moon. The barn door rolled open to the kind of cold that barks at teeth, and the small engine rasped to life. Headlights poured into the snow like two white ropes, and Lydia pointed them uphill. The forest swallowed her. Trails she knew by daylight turned unfamiliar in powder and shadow. She drove by feel as much as sight, by the rhythms of ruts and frozen roots, by the way spruce tips leaned on old wind. Snow peppered her goggles and beaded on the scarf across her mouth. The collar ping sent small vibrations through her glove, a heartbeat on her wrist. Every time it hesitated, she felt something in her chest hesitate with it. Back at the den, Mara shifted and pushed, and a sound came out of her that belonged to caves and winters and mothers who refused surrender. The pain crested. Nothing followed. Her claws scored shallow grooves in the packed dirt. Brutus set his feet in the doorway, full of a fury that had nowhere to go. When a gray wolf broke the tree line and paused on a boulder, Brutus lowered his head and let the warning travel the cold like iron. A booming huff, a rumble that said line drawn. The wolf's ears flattened, then it stepped down and circled, eyes reflecting starlight that did not exist tonight. Another wolf came up on the right, careful, calculating. They knew how to be patient. Hunger was patient when it needed to be. Lydia cut the engine below the ridge to avoid broadcasting her arrival to half the valley. The sudden quiet rang. She killed her headlamp and listened to the mountain. Wind, a faint keening through the snags, the creak of snow settling. Then, there, a bear's long moan, strained and thin as thread. She slung the trauma pack and climbed, boots sinking to the ankle, calf, knee, as the slope steepened. At a stand of fir hammered by an old ice storm, she paused, pulled off a glove, and touched the dart gun to check the safety. Her breath fogged the sight for a heartbeat and cleared. The den was a darker dark under a slab of rock. Lydia eased to one side, unwilling to silhouette herself in the mouth like prey. Another sound reached her, lower and closer, a bear's chuff that held warning and plea in one breath. Brutus stepped forward, shadow within shadow, shoulders wide as the doorway, eyes twin embers held deep. His lips lifted just enough to show decision waiting. Lydia kept her hands wide and empty a moment, let the cold bite them, and spoke low through the scarf. "Easy, big man. I'm here for her." He swayed, measuring, and in that sway was a library of choices. Crush, charge, bluff, believe. Behind him, Lydia glimpsed Mara's flank shudder, a wet gleam on dark fur that didn't brighten with life. The wolves shifted at the tree line like anxious thoughts. Lydia angled her body to put herself between the den and that gray ripple. She drew a dart, seated it with the smallest click she could manage, and leveled the gun at Brutus. Not to bring him down, just to soften his edges if the balance toppled. He lowered his head to her knee height and sniffed the cold that smelled like metal and woman and long nights. The world held. Then he did the one thing she did not expect. He stepped back, just half a stride, enough to clear the mouth for the pack on her shoulder. It was not permission. It was a wager. Inside the den, heat lifted off the earth. Lydia knelt by Mara and slid a palm along the ribcage. The rise and fall were shallow and stuttering. The firmness low in the abdomen told a grim story. The cub was wedged wrong. She murmured to a creature who did not know human words and set a hand on the big jaw for grounding anyway. "Hang on, Mama." She snapped open a sterile kit, prepped a line, and laid the tranq gun within reach, but pointed away from Mara. Outside, snow hissed under moving paws. Brutus thundered from the entrance with a sound that made Lydia's bones want to bow. She heard the thud, the scuffle, a cut-off yelp. When she looked, a wolf veered back with a bleeding cheek, another ghosting left to test an angle Brutus couldn't cover at the same time. Time thinned. Lydia checked her watch and did the terrible arithmetic of cold, shock, and fetus distress. A full surgical intervention in a den was madness, but waiting for transport here could make the decision for them. She slid a catheter with hands that would not shake and squeezed warm fluids to coax back a failing rhythm. Mara's eyes fluttered, and for the first time that night, a small, raw hope pressed against Lydia's ribs. The wind rose. It drove the snow in sharp grains that stung the inside of the den. Brutus backed into the doorway again, bleeding now from a foreleg, his chest heaving like a bellows. He looked at Lydia over his shoulder with a glance so brief it might have been nothing, yet she felt seen and conscripted. She raised the radio to her mouth and made her voice level. "Dispatch Cooper. I need the Rock Creek team and a snow-capable unit at Sawtooth East, marker 11. Pregnant sow distressed, likely obstructed labor. Adult male present, but holding. Wolves nearby. I'll stabilize until you arrive." "Copy, Cooper. 25 out if the Ridge Road holds." 25. In that number lived endings she refused. Lydia loaded a microdose into the tranq and angled it into the thick of Mara's shoulder, just enough to ease the panic without drowning breath. She stroked the hillside of that great body, while the drug smoothed the edges of fear. Outside, Brutus feinted left, then launched right, a black avalanche startling a pair of wolves into a backpedal skitter that clawed sparks from ice. He was buying time, the only currency the mountain respected. The den quieted to a narrow world. The slide of Lydia's gloves, the rhythmic squeeze of a fluid bag under her forearm, Mara's breath counting its stubborn tally. Once, the rate stuttered and went thin. Lydia bent low and spoke into an ear, furred with frost. "You've come this far. One more bend in the river." The breath took again, fragile, but there. The glow of headlights came first as a rumor in the trees, then as a pale wash against snow, ghosting between trunks. Brutus froze, then paced, torn between challenging the lights and holding the door to his family. When the first rescuer waded into view with a stretcher and a low voice made of calm winter, Lydia felt something unclench. She slid her hands under Mara's chest with the teams and counted them out into the night. The cold bit through her knees when she rose. The wolves drifted back to the edge of light and watched, the way hunger always watches what it cannot steal. They strapped Mara into the sled cradle and inched her down the slope toward the snow track where the rescue rig idled. Brutus followed 3 paces behind, leaving coins of blood along the trail that the storm immediately tried to cover. At the loading gate, he halted as if an invisible line forbade him. He lifted his head, searching Lydia's face for an answer she could not give. She laid a palm against the gate and spoke the promise anyway. "I'll bring her back." The doors closed. The engine's hum deepened, and the rig took the first careful bite of the road. Through the small rear window, Lydia watched Brutus set his paws in the track they had made and begin to follow. Not charging, not roaring, only moving with a grave, deliberate certainty. Snow gathered on his back like a shawl. The mountain took in the long caravan and let it pass, as if it too understood the wager laid down tonight. That trust, once risked, can make the impossible turn and face the light. The rescue rig climbed the ridge in low gear, throwing a steady tremor through the floor plates. Inside the compartment, heat blew thin and metallic, fogging the small window before the fan cleared it again. Mara lay strapped into the sled cradle, her breath shallow, her paws twitching in faint, exhausted rhythms. A pulse sensor blinked in a stubborn green that sometimes hesitated, then corrected itself, as if arguing with the night. Lydia rode beside her on a bench with the trauma pack open, like a toolbox of last chances, one palm steady on Mara's chest, to feel what the monitor might miss. The storm knocked on the walls. Snow hit in buckets, then needles, then soft handfuls that made a hush. Through the back window, Lydia could see the world strobe in the red of the tail light and the white of the flurries, and within that strobe a shape kept pace. Brutus moved in the track the rig carved, head low, foreleg marked by a dark line where the wolf's tooth had opened him. He did not hurry. He did not fall back. He simply stayed. A jolt bucked the sled and sent a metal rattle across the compartment. "Hold her," the driver called over the intercom without turning. "Drift across the old burn scar. I'll crawl it." The rig's engine dropped to a growl. Chains clinked in. Slow, patient turns. Lydia checked the IV port and squeezed warm fluids until the bag wrinkled in her fist and the new one took its place. Mara's belly tightened again, the old, useless wave, and passed like a bad thought. Lydia leaned in and spoke into a small, frosted world of ear and fur. "Not yet. Stay with me." Another jolt, harsher, and the rig slewed half a yard left. The driver eased off the throttle. Outside, the wind found a new octave as it poured across a cut where fire had erased the big trees years ago, and young ones had not yet taken full hold. The headlights swung across a stand of blackened snags that looked like bones. Somewhere in that dark, wolves ran, their bodies stitched to the shape of the land. Lydia thought of their eyes, level and untroubled, and of Brutus's eyes, storm-lit and deciding. The radio hissed. "Rock Creek team, this is Cooper. Status?" A calm voice answered, the kind of calm that belongs to those who always meet the bad nights. "Ore prepped. Heat up. 2 vets on site. 3rd en route. We're clearing the bay. Watch the switchback past mile marker 6. Tree down earlier." The driver's hand lifted in a silent thanks and settled again. Lydia glanced at Brutus through the glass. He had to swing wide around the drift, and for a moment he disappeared. When he came back into the taillight, his back looked smaller under the snow, but his pace hadn't changed. Half a mile later, the road threw them its trap. A spruce had gone down in the last gust and lay across the track like a bar. The driver braked and feathered them to a stop with a small sigh. "We cut it or winch it," he said. "Cutting takes time." He flicked a look at the pulse monitor and then at Lydia. The green paint of the indicator blinked obediently, but Lydia felt Mara's breath stutter under her palm, a small hitch that admitted to fatigue. "We winch," she said. They hopped down into snow that took them to mid-shin, the cold grabbing at their ankles like a live thing. Brutus stopped 10 paces off, chest pumping, his nose working the air that smelled of hot engine and antiseptic and fear. The driver flung the cable around the trunk and signaled. The rig tugged and the spruce groaned. Frost popped under strain like small knuckles cracking. The cable lifted slack, then went taut again as the tree shifted inch by inch, scraping ice with a low, dry moan. Lydia glanced at Brutus and saw his ears tilt to the sound. He stood his ground, bleeding into the snow with a patience that hurt to watch. Back inside, the compartment felt warmer, almost human. Lydia adjusted the cradle straps and lifted Mara's hindquarters a fraction with a wedge pad, a trick that sometimes eased a jam when time was against you. She checked the position again, with practiced, gentle pressure, and found no gift waiting. The cub was still wrong. She opened the trank case and drew up a whisper of medicine to smooth the panic spike that rode under Mara's hide. Brutus, framed by the window, paused, sniffed, and rumbled, soft, questioning. "Just easing her fear," Lydia said aloud, less for him than to remind herself that words mattered even when the listener spoke another language. They hit the county road at last, where plows had won a narrow lane from the storm, and the engine climbed in confidence. The rig's lights threw the sign for the Wildlife Center out of the dark like a promise. At the gate, the driver reached for the switch. Lydia looked back. Brutus trotted to the threshold and stopped, as if a law older than fences told him to. Snow had gathered along his spine. He watched the gate swing wide and the red tail light slip through. Then he lowered his head and stood, arching breath into the night. He did not try to enter. He did not leave. They rolled into a wash of sodium lamps and shoveled paths. Doors opened. Hands waited. The smell turned from pine and iron to alcohol and warm rubber. The vets moved with quick, quiet efficiency, voices pitched low, questions cut into slivers. They slid Mara from field cradle to gurney and snapped new sensors in place. Numbers bloomed on a screen in strong colors, a medical meadow where every blade had a name. One of the vets, a woman with gray at her temples and a steady way of seeing, lifted Lydia's hand off the bear's chest, only to put it back on a new spot. "Stay with her," she said. "Your touch is rhythm now." Through the wide bay door, Lydia could still see Brutus at the fence. He had settled into the snow as if building himself a chair, head up, eyes fixed on the rectangle of light that had swallowed his world. A guard hesitated. "You want me to try to haze him?" Lydia shook her head. "Not unless he comes to the gate. He's made us a bargain." The check ran like a river. Blood gas, hydration, reflex. The confirmation landed with the thud of something already suspected. Obstructed labor, fetal distress likely, surgery indicated. The older vet met Lydia's look and didn't dress it up. "We go now. Prep 2 packs. Warmed saline. We'll keep it small and fast." Lydia nodded, but the nod felt like part of someone else. She stripped her gloves, washed up to her elbows in water that steamed and bit her raw skin, and pulled on fresh gloves that squeaked when she flexed her fingers. Mara's eyelids fluttered when they wheeled her toward the operating room, as if some thin thread bound her to the moving light and the smells and the hands that held her. Lydia leaned close and let her voice be a rail. "You've been brave. Be brave a little longer." She glanced once, only once, toward the open bay. Brutus had not moved. Snow sifted down and softened his edges, but could not erase the shape. He lifted his muzzle as the gurney passed from sight, breathing in whatever scent of his family the wind allowed. In the quiet, just before the doors closed, the mountain seemed to fold itself around this small, bright room, and all the wagers it contained: steel, gauze, experience, love, and a trust no one would have predicted when the night began. The vets took their positions. The anesthetist checked the line and murmured the counts. The clock said 2 in the morning and, with a small, courteous tick, gave them the next minute to use well. The operating room felt both too bright and not bright enough, the overhead lamps cutting a hard circle of white against the steady hum of machines. Outside the wide window, wind knifed across the floodlights of the bay, lifting curtains of snow that drifted and dissolved before touching the ground. Beyond that glow, just as he had since the moment they arrived, Brutus lay in a shallow bed of frost by the fence, still as a carved thing, his eyes facing the building that held his entire world. Inside, Mara's chest rose and fell in shallow, fluttering arcs. The anesthetist monitored the numbers with the calm of long winters spent in emergency rooms, while 2 vets worked with small, precise movements. Lydia stood at Mara's shoulder, her gloved hand resting against the slope of the bear's neck, offering what the older vet had called rhythm. Mara's heart needed it. Lydia did too. She felt the subtle tremors running through that massive body, and she whispered steady encouragement to a creature who could not understand her words, but seemed to recognize the intention beneath them. The incision was clean, small for the size of the patient, made with the kind of care that comes from knowing the difference between necessary harm and needless injury. But the moment they eased the uterine wall aside, the first vet let out a tight breath. "It's as bad as we feared," she murmured. "The cub is wedged deep. No movement." The other vet adjusted the retractor, jaw clenched. "We'll go one step at a time." Mara's heart rate dipped. A thin alarm chirped once, then steadied. Lydia felt her own pulse jump in her throat. She stroked the curve of the bear's cheek, feeling warmth under the fur that seemed too fragile to last. Her voice caught in a whisper. "Stay here. Stay with them." A gust slammed the outer wall. The window pane shivered. Snowflakes clung to the glass like ash. Brutus lifted his head at the sound, ears pivoting toward the building. His breath plumed in slow, heavy clouds. He looked exhausted, yet anchored, like a sentinel carved into the storm. Inside, the vets worked in a silence so focused it felt like reverence. When the first cub finally slid free, limp, motionless, a slick curve of fur and tiny paws, the anesthetist grimaced. "No cry." The older vet immediately handed the cub to Lydia. "Stimulate. Rub firmly." Her voice was firm, but not unkind. Lydia cupped the small body in both hands and rubbed along the ribs with a towel warmed from an incubator drawer. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a tiny, hoarse squeak crackled in the air like a spark. The cub kicked once. Weak, but alive. "Good," the vet whispered. "One more to go." The second cub came easier, but with even less strength. Its first breath sounded like a question. Lydia rubbed and whispered and pressed its body against a heating pad, willing its lungs to find their rhythm. Another faint squeak. 2 lives pulled from a narrowing margin. The vets exchanged a look, something between worry and expectation. "There should have been a third," the younger vet said, checking the charts, then Mara's abdomen. "Her scans suggested 3, but I'm not seeing—" "Wait." Her fingers paused. The room stilled. "There's something here. Small. Feels different." The older vet leaned over. "Let's bring it out." When the tiny form slid into view, even the anesthetist let out a soft, startled sound. The cub was noticeably smaller than its siblings, its fur pale, too pale. It wasn't white like snow, it was white like moonlit quartz, almost glowing under the surgical lights. The older vet inhaled. "Albino," she whispered. "Good Lord, I've never—" The cub didn't move. Lydia didn't wait for an order. She reached for the smallest towel, warmed it with her hands, and wrapped the little body gently. It weighed almost nothing. She rubbed its chest, stroked the muzzle, tapped the tiny flank in a steady rhythm. "Come on," she murmured. "Come on, little one. Your mama fought too hard for you." A long moment stretched like a held breath in the room. Machines hummed. Snow hissed outside. Brutus sat in the storm with his head lifted, as if he sensed something changing on a scale too fine for human comprehension. Lydia kept rubbing, feeling every ounce of her will pour through her hands. Then the cub gasped. A faint cry, thin yet astonishing, fluttered from its throat. Lydia nearly laughed, a tremble of relief running through her. The older vet pressed her shoulder. "Good work. Let's get them all stable." As they tended to the cubs, a sudden alarm blared. Sharp, urgent. Mara's heart rate dipped sharply on the screen, the line dipping like a swallow avoiding a branch. The anesthetist swore softly. "She's crashing." Lydia's stomach clenched. The vets moved fast. Fluids increased. Another injection. Hands adjusting equipment with swift, practiced certainty. Lydia kept her hand on Mara's neck, repeating a steady whisper. "Come back. Come back. You're almost there." For a few terrifying seconds, Mara's heartbeat flickered like a candle trying to decide. The storm roared against the building, a long rolling gust that rattled the metal siding. And then, slowly, haltingly, the rhythm returned. Weak, uneven, but present. "She's stabilizing," the anesthetist said, easing out a breath. "Let's close." The vets sutured carefully, layer by layer, while Lydia cradled each cub against warmed cloth inside the incubator basin. The albino cub remained curled, tiny paws tucked under its chin, but its breaths had begun to deepen. Occasionally it made a small, whispery noise, as if getting used to the idea of being alive. Outside the window, Brutus stood again, despite the deepening snow. He leaned closer to the glass, nose lifted to scents only he could trace. His fur collected frost, his injured leg trembled, but he refused to move away. When the surgery lights finally dimmed to half power, and Mara was moved to recovery, Lydia walked alongside the gurney. Mara looked impossibly tired, her breathing ragged but steady. Lydia brushed her knuckles along the bear's shoulder. "You did it," she whispered. She passed the window once more, and met Brutus's eyes through the glass. There was no rage there, no fear, only a raw, unwavering patience that pierced her deeper than any roar could have. He took a step toward the fence, pressing his massive weight into the drift. Snow slid from his back. He stood tall, as if presenting himself for news. In the recovery room, Lydia placed the incubator beside Mara so the mother could smell what she could not yet touch. The cubs stirred, tiny and blind, their small cries filling the quiet space. The albino cub wriggled weakly, seeking warmth. As Lydia looked at them, 3 fragile sparks that had nearly never existed, she realized the impossible had already begun. And outside, a father waited in the snow, refusing to leave until the mountain itself released him from his vigil. Morning crept into the Bitterroot Valley without color, as if the storm had washed all brightness from the sky. Thin sunlight filtered through the clouds in pale ribbons, touching the snowdrifts outside the Rock Creek Wildlife Center. The world was quiet. Too quiet. It was the kind of silence that followed long nights of fear and work, the kind of silence that dared hope to breathe again. Inside the recovery room, Mara lay on a thick bed of warming pads, her breaths slow but steadier than they had been in hours. Her fur had been brushed free of dried blood, her wounds cleaned, her body wrapped in soft thermal blankets. Beside her, in a broad incubator layered with fleece, the 3 cubs slept in a huddle, a tangle of tiny limbs and soft squeaks. The albino cub, smaller but determined, nestled at the center, its white fur glowing faintly under the gentle heat lamps. Every few minutes, one of the cubs shifted, protesting softly, reminding anyone listening that life still insisted on itself. Lydia stood near the window, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm in her hands. She hadn't slept. Exhaustion clung to her like another layer of clothes. But she didn't feel tired. Not in a way that mattered. She watched the fence line where Brutus had spent the entire night. He had never moved far, not even when the plows rumbled through the parking area, not even when the temperature dropped before dawn. He stood now in a shallow crater of melted snow, his breath rolling steadily, eyes fixed on the building. A soft knock sounded behind her. One of the vets poked his head in. "She's ready," he said. "We can move her to the transitional enclosure whenever you give the word." Lydia glanced at the bears, then the window. "And him?" The vet huffed a quiet laugh. "He hasn't left. I don't think he will until she walks out of here on her own." Lydia set her cup down and approached the incubator. She lifted the smallest cub, the white one, with both hands, marveling at its warmth and weight, so slight yet so determined. The cub squirmed weakly, letting out a soft sound, a sound closer to a sigh than a cry. She held it where Mara could smell it. At first there was no reaction. Then Mara's nose twitched, just once, and her eyelids fluttered open. She blinked slowly, confused, then drew in a long breath. Her eyes locked onto the tiny bundle. "You're not done fighting," Lydia murmured. "Not yet." The transition team assembled outside the recovery room, pushing a reinforced transport cart padded with straw. The doors to the winter enclosure were already open, heaters running, fresh branches and bedding arranged in a sheltered corner. This wasn't the wild, not yet, but it was the halfway step Mara needed before the mountain reclaimed her. Moving her was slow work. The vets checked her sutures, adjusted her fluids, then eased her onto the padded cart. Mara grunted, not in pain, but effort. When the first cub cried out from the incubator, her ears twitched. It was the clearest sign yet that she was gathering herself. As they rolled Mara down the wide hallway toward the enclosure gates, Lydia walked beside her, one hand steady on the bear's shoulder. Behind them, an assistant carried the incubator with exaggerated care, eyes fixed on the precious cargo inside. They reached the heavy steel doors, separating the clinic from the winter rehabilitation yard. The staff opened them carefully, letting in a gust of cold air that wrapped around them like a warning and an invitation. Outside, the snow shone with a faint morning sheen, unbroken except for one set of tracks, deep, steady prints leading from the fence to the gate. Brutus stood there. He was closer than Lydia expected, close enough that the staff tensed and hesitated. His fur was crusted with ice along his shoulders, and the wound on his leg had matted in places. Yet he stood tall, unshaken, anchored by something older than fear. Lydia raised a hand. "Easy. Give them the space." They pulled the cart a few feet into the enclosure. As soon as the gate closed behind them, Brutus stepped forward, slow and deliberate. His ears tipped forward, then the rest of him followed, as if gravity itself dragged him toward the scent he had waited all night for. When Mara lifted her head, the world seemed to pause. Her eyes met his, dull from exhaustion, yet burning with recognition. Brutus stopped inches from the cart, lowered his massive skull, and pressed his nose gently against the fur of her cheek. A deep rumble rose from his chest, not dominance, not warning, something softer, something that belonged only to those who had nearly lost the one they loved. Lydia swallowed hard. She'd seen reunions before, but never one that felt like watching the earth settle after a tremor. One of the vets nodded. "Let's give her back her family." Carefully, Lydia lifted the incubator door and took out the first cub. She set it on the straw near Mara's foreleg. The tiny creature wobbled, squeaked, then instinct drew it toward the warmth of its mother. Mara breathed in sharply, a low sound caught between exhaustion and relief. The second cub was placed beside its sibling. This one rolled onto its side, paws flailing until it bumped against Mara's leg. Then came the smallest one. Lydia held the albino cub for a moment longer, her thumb brushing its tiny shoulder. "You're the miracle, aren't you?" she whispered. The cub's pale fur shimmered in the cold light, as if it carried a sliver of dawn inside it. She set it gently with the others. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Mara shifted. Slowly, painfully, she curled her great body around the three small shapes. Her nose bumped each cub in turn, checking them, claiming them. The white cub let out a faint, tremulous chirp. Mara responded with a long, low breath, warm enough to mist in the air. Brutus stepped closer and lowered himself beside them, careful not to crowd, careful not to disturb. He reached out with his muzzle and touched each cub lightly. When he reached the white one, he paused, nostrils flaring in surprise. Then he touched it too, with a tenderness that silenced every human watching. The vets backed away. Lydia remained, leaning slightly on the railing, unable to pull herself from the moment. It felt sacred somehow, like witnessing something the mountain had kept secret for 100 winters. A family rebuilt, a life reclaimed, a miracle that refused to stay a rumor. Minutes passed. The cubs nursed. Mara's breathing found a steady cadence. Brutus's eyes half closed, his body finally loosening after a night carved from fear. When the sun finally broke through the thinning clouds, a thin shaft of gold fell across the enclosure, landing on the white cub. Its pale fur shimmered like sparked frost. Lydia found herself smiling, not the tired smile of someone who had survived the night, but the quiet smile of someone who had witnessed something true. "Welcome back to the world," she whispered. The family shifted together, forming a single warm shape against the cold. And as the light touched them, spreading across the straw and the snow beyond, it was clear to everyone present that the impossible had not only become real, it was alive, breathing, nursing, and nestled in the crook of its mother's arm. A legacy born from trust, from courage, and from a night when the mountain decided to give life instead of taking it away. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments so I know you were here with me till the very end. Your voice means more than you think. And if you'd like to stay with us for the next unbelievable wildlife tale, make sure to subscribe and keep the little bell on. There are many more miracles in the mountains, and I'd love for you to be here when the next one begins.